Kevin Griffin is the owner of SwiftKick and a Microsoft MVP. He is an author and a teacher and a mentor and a consultant focusing on software development. He is a 10-time Microsoft MVP. That's amazing, dude.
11
Specializing in 11 time. Okay, yeah. Nice. Specializing in ASP.NET and web development. As the owner of SwiftKick, a software training and services company, Kevin specializes in helping businesses push their technology stacks into the 21st century. You can often find Kevin speaking at conferences and user groups across the country. That is true. I've seen you many times. Or blogging at kevingriffin.com. In his spare time, Kevin is the co-host of the popular Two Frugal Dudes podcast. So without further ado, Kevin.
Yay. All right. Hi, everybody. So I can't see your all smiling faces, so I'm just going to assume you're smiling. I'm going to assume you're coffeeed up, but we're going to have a good time. So let me go ahead and get my screen shared here. So make sure that we're all in the right place. This is the web track, and I'm going to talk about single page application architectures with Vue and ASP.NET Core. So as Lee just graciously said, I am a Microsoft MVP. I love working with ASP.NET, ASP.NET Core, and Microsoft Azure. So if you have any resources you need filled on your team, you need some expertise to come in and chat with you, reach out to me. I would love to talk. I also do a regular Twitch stream. I say regular. It's once or twice a week. I get on Twitch and I just talk about topics relating to ASP.NET Core, Azure, and whatever I'm currently working on. My email address, my Twitter up on the screen. I would love to chat with you afterwards if you have any questions. The resources for this particular talk, after everything's said and done, is at my site, consultwithgriff.com. SPAs with Vue.js and ASP.NET Core, it's kind of easy to find. So for this discussion, let's start with just kind of a basic history lesson. If you're sitting here, you probably are a .NET developer, or if you've worked with .NET for any period of time in the past. So the kind of history of how .NET has presented client-side web applications is, it's a fun story to have. It initially all started with ASP.NET Web Forms, where Microsoft really needed to turn WinForm developers building on the Windows desktop into web developers. And you have to imagine this is in the early 2000s. They're trailblazing, trying to push stuff forward. They had this thing called Classic ASP that a lot of applications were built on, but they needed to get people onto the web. So web forms kind of became the natural extension of, if you know how to develop in WinForms, you can develop in web forms. Web forms is really chatty. There's a lot to it. There's a lot of syntax. And the web was kind of going towards this leaner approach, more JavaScript and more on the actual browsers themselves, because the browsers were getting better, smarter, faster. So, the story goes, Scott Gu was on a plane one day. He wrote the first version of Microsoft's ASP.NET MVC, and that introduced Razor's syntax, which was a little bit more scaled down to the metal version of HTML with a little bit of C# or Visual Basic, if that's your poison, mixed in. But, the web just keeps moving at its own pace. And there are certain aspects where Razor didn't really keep up with it. And we start seeing a lot of applications go into this raw HTML and JavaScript with frameworks like Vue, React, Angular, you name it. I should probably also put a hexagon up here for Blazor. I love the concept of Blazor. I haven't made the switch to recommending it for my consulting clients. I don't think it's there yet. I think it's great for internal applications. I'd be a little resistant doing this for a public-facing line of business application. That's just my personal thought. I know there's a Blazor talk coming up later today, so it's good to have options. Is really the way to go. So if we're over on The web, you've heard of one of these three frameworks. There's React, there's Angular, there's Vue. And I'm going to talk more specifically about Vue because I love Vue. I have built production web applications in all three of these platforms, or all 10 of these platforms if you count every version of Angular. The bar none, hands down, Vue is the best experience that I have had with any of these. I almost say that React and Angular are more just things that you support because that's what they were originally written in. If I was doing greenfield development, Vue 100% all the way. So some common aspects of these client-side applications, or client-side application frameworks, is that they're all CLI-based, command line interface. So when you start developing them, you're not necessarily going file new and creating a file and just going to town. You are starting with a command line interface and you're scaffolding out an actual application. You're working inside of two different processes. You have your development process and you have your deployment, your production process. It's just the same way if you're running C#. You develop in debug mode, but you release in release mode. In client-side applications, it's the same way. You want to make sure that you're working in an environment that you can debug easily, figure out exactly what's going on. It might be a little bit slower, a little unoptimized, all that good stuff. But when you push that in production, you want optimized, ready to go, just as fast as humanly possible code. One of the kind of concepts I'm going to push forward here is that our front ends and our back end infrastructures are completely separate. Our front end doesn't care where it's getting served up from. So it's not like with an ASP.NET MVC Razor application where you're doing it all in the Razor app. So it's serving up server-side rendered code. The front end can come from anywhere. It can come from an ASP.NET application. It can come from blob storage. It could come from new Azure static web apps, which I love talking about. It just doesn't care where it's coming from. It's the back end that really matters because that's where all the data and the business logic is going to exist. The front end also doesn't care where it's getting that data from. So it could be an ASP.NET Core API. It could be Azure Functions. It could be AWS Lambda. The front end doesn't care. So we're talking two completely different methodologies, and trying to develop and work in both of these arenas is a little complicated. You're not going to get the red carpet experience that you would if you were just building ASP.NET MVC Razor, or even like Blazor for that matter now. So I asked myself, how in an ASP.NET Core world can we better support these types of applications? And I've come up with a couple processes because I've iterated on this with different clients as my guinea pig. My goals of this talk is I want to discuss my approach for building spas with Vue.js and ASP.NET Core. And I call it my approach because there's very little documentation out there on this approach. It's like Microsoft or folks are pretending that this does not exist as a problem, and you kind of have to search for solutions that work best for you. And I've had many people come up to me after doing this particular talk and going, yes, this this is the bit I was looking for. Thank you. And then they move forward and their project is a success. I've done a couple iterations of this talk, and I've learned that the best way to talk through this process is basically question answer. I'm going to ask a question of myself, and I'm going to sit back and answer it. In the same way that I think you would out in the audience ask a question about a process, and I want to try to answer those questions along the way. I want to talk about a couple different libraries, and instead of just telling you, all right, use this library, use that library, I want to explain what it is and why it's something that you want to use. You're not going to learn everything about Vue.js. Sorry, I wish I had time for that. That's actually a really good workshop, Vue.js, and then everything about ASP.NET Core. I'm going to assume you probably have more experience with ASP.NET Core than you do Vue.js, but who knows? The examples are pretty straightforward, in my opinion. So if you don't understand what's going on, you can kind of just look at the slide for a moment and say, oh, okay, I kind of understand what's going on here. All right, let's talk about architecture from like a 10,000 foot level. We're essentially talking two applications. We have our ASP.NET Core backend, and this could be the API later. It has a couple main responsibilities. First is data access and business logic. It's the thing behind, or I'm sorry, it's the thing in front of the database. It's going to control who can get in. It's going to control what they do, authentication and authorization. The thing I always like to say is that the client, the UI, is just a shell for functionality, but it actually should never contain any real business logic, or you should never trust its business logic. The backend should be the single source of truth for everything. Then you have the front end, and the front end is what's actually presented to the user. They go to the browser, they type something in, the Vue.js app will load, and it takes care of a couple of its own responsibilities. You have routing. So if it's a single page application, there might be 10,000 different client views that a user could see. So routing helps determine what is shown at what time. Next, we have state management, because as you load this application, it doesn't have any data with it. So how do you load some sort of basic state that you can present to the user can manipulate? And more importantly, how can that state get updated in real time from the backend, or send data to the backend and then refresh itself? That's a discussion on its own. And then we have data fetching, which is just, all right, I need to go get data from a server, whether it's ASP.NET Core, whether it's some sort of serverless architecture. We have to go get data. So how do you do that? All right. First basic question, Kevin, what do I need to know about Vue to even start this discussion? And more importantly, these conversations we're having don't need to revolve around Vue. It could be React, it could be Angular. They all kind of are the same in this regard. All right, so Vue. Vue is a client-side web application framework. Yay. It's component-based, so you're not building out. It's not like back in the jQuery days where you would write a bunch of HTML and then we'd have jQuery come in and kind of functionally, all right, change this or set an event handler on that. Everything in Vue is based on an individual component. So that might be a user listing. It might just be a logo up in the corner of the screen. A component is really whatever you make of it. This is an example of what we call a single file component in Vue.js, where I have a snippet of HTML. I can style it with some CSS or Sass or less. And then I have some code that's very specific to that snippet of HTML. So this contains little things like just some basic state for that component, some event handlers, different properties that I want to pass in. What's great is that it's all maintained in this little component, this file. It's very separated. So if I have one of these, or if I have 10,000 of these, I can kind of figure out what's going on just because it's one single file component. And my favorite part, and this is a Vue thing, is that it's limited opinion. You can come in here and you can build out your component, but where are you getting your data from? Well, it's not like Angular that says you need to use our HTTP provider, or you need to use this, you need to use that. Vue says, I'm giving you this little piece of the framework, and everything else is kind of open to you, what your needs are, because maybe you don't want to use what I would give you. Maybe you have another platform that you like for data access. So I love that it's limited opinion. It's also why Vue apps can be traditionally smaller, because you're limiting what you're building. There's not much in there. So how do you build up a Vue.js application from the ground up? Like I said, everything starts from the CLI. Make sure you install these CLI tools with either npm or yarn. And if you're out there and you're a yarn user, let me know. I have not actually met a yarn user in the flesh, but according to Twitter, it's what everyone uses. So install the CLI. But Kevin, let's reiterate, why would I even use the CLI? Like, you don't need the CLI to build a Vue.js application, so why take this extra step? That's a great question, Kevin. Like we said, you don't need the CLI to build a Vue.js application. You can just open up a new file. You can do it as inline script in an HTML file. But the CLI does know how to build a good basic scaffold for a Vue.js application. It gives you enough of the code's like ceremony to get started, where you can just jump in, remove a couple things, and just start adding some value. On top of that, it also has a built-in pipeline for development and also for production. So during development mode, when you start building your app, you can take advantage of hot reload. So you're working on some code, you hit save, all of a sudden over in the browser, everything just updates automatically because it gets hot reloaded. And because they're all components, because of Vue, you're only updating individual components on the screen. You're not doing a full page refresh. And then when you go into production, you can do a production build, and that's all built into the pipeline. So it wires up things like Webpack. Webpack goes through, looks at all your JavaScript, looks at all your CSS, other dependencies. It can package and optimize all those into the best possible version of itself for production. And anyone who's ever set up Webpack before knows Webpack is not a fun tool. It's a powerful tool, but it's not a fun tool to use. So having it all obfuscated away from me actually helps a ton, because I don't like playing in Webpack unless I absolutely have to. Version upgrades. Vue React Angular, they're updating constantly, and having to upgrade your packages independently is a little bit cumbersome, because, well, if you upgrade to the next version of Vue, maybe you have to upgrade Webpack as well. This is bolded because this is the reason I went from not using the CLI to using the CLI. I had deployed a React application years ago, and one of the features of a CLI is that you can eject code when everything's said and done, and you have to maintain those versions independently. Well, you never eject code from a CLI, because what ended up happening is we pushed in production, everything went great. I thought I was smarter than the CLI. I can maintain this no problem. React had a major version upgrade, and I'm like, all right, this is cool. Let's increment a number in the package.json file, install everything, and be good to go. No. Turns out, in order to upgrade React, you also had to upgrade Webpack. And to upgrade Webpack, you had to upgrade all of Webpack's little plugins. And some of the plugins were deprecated. Some were replaced by other things. It was a complete mess, to the point where I spent 3 weeks on this project just trying to upgrade our version of React, and then said, nope, this is just going to stay this version of React for a period of time. And that sounds good in theory, but then a year or so later, we went, okay, let's actually figure out how to upgrade this app. And the solution was just putting it back into the React CLI scaffold, where it just took care of everything for us. And that actually just ended up taking a week, but now it's been under the CLI for the entire time. So that's my recommendation. Never eject your CLI infrastructures. Just leave them as they are. Your life will just be easier. Because I upgraded Vue a couple weeks ago, and just one command line. It took care of everything for me. And that's what I like to see. we'll run through this part pretty quickly, but if you're at the command line, you want to create a new Vue application, it actually runs you through a wizard. So you can just set some defaults, or you can go through and manually select your own features. A couple that I recommend, Babel is really good if you're supporting older browsers. If you like writing in TypeScript, which I'm hit or miss on TypeScript. I like TypeScript, and sometimes I don't like TypeScript. But actually, Vue version 3, which is coming out, is released now, but it's not fully out yet, is 100% TypeScript. So you can select TypeScript from here. If you need to support PWAs, you can do that. We'll talk about router and Vuex here in a couple of minutes, but those are usually good things to add in. If you need any sort of pre-processing for CSS, like Less or Sass, you can add those in as well. And then if you need silly things like unit testing, those are baked in as well. Like EDE testing will automatically install Cypress and set up a test configuration for you. So all you have to do is just go start writing tests. It's really straightforward. Always recommend some sort of linting. I just do error prevention, because the nicest part about this is when you do a build, it's going to tell you if you have console.log in your application anywhere, because you don't want to go live with that stuff. So ESLint, just the basic properties. I always lint on save. Yay. Put everything into dedicated config files, because you will edit the config. Unless your application is tiny, you're going to have to make changes to the configuration, and do that in individual configuration files. All right. The reason I don't do this part live is that this single part can take a minute or two, depending on how slow npm is. It installs all the packages, does all the configuration, and then when you're done, say, all right, well, you can just cd into your new folder and you can run the application. Yay. So npm run serve generates a development build of your app. It runs on one of your local hosts. Usually it's 8080. In my screenshot, it's 8081 because I was dumb and I was running like 2 versions of this app. So localhost 8080 or 8081. And what this is going to do is it's in real time going to build the HTML, CSS images and the JavaScript that you need to run your app. So going into the browser, it's going to compile all this stuff in real time, and that allows it to do hot reloads and hot rebuilds of your entire application. It also produces source maps. So if you're writing in TypeScript, but you're in Chrome or the new Microsoft Edge, it will show you, here's the TypeScript that you were working with, and automatically does all that translation. It's a development server. And when everything's said and done, you have this really fancy Vue app. But this is just the Vue app. So Kevin, how do we start introducing ASP.NET Core into this conversation? Well, a new ASP.NET Core web application is really simple. It's not that 10-step process that Vue is. It's just .NET new. And I create a web application. We'll call it backend. And backend is one step, and it just creates a very basic ASP.NET Core app. But there's nothing in it. Like, it doesn't have MVC, it doesn't have any API functionality, it doesn't do anything, which is exactly what I like. So we're almost there. We have a backend and we have a front end application. So now let's take the next step forward and let's discuss SPAs, or single page architectures. So a SPA is pretty straightforward. You have this simple index.html file, and that's all that gets served up to the browser. So if you go to my domain / something, it's only ever going to return index.html. And this index.html is what is before it gets processed by Vue.js. One of the things that Vue.js will do when it builds a production version of this app is, you see down at the bottom where it says built files will be auto-injected here. Well, that's what Vue does, is it generates a couple dozen JavaScript files or CSS files, and it injects them into this index.html file, So that gets served up to the client. And this HTML is really smart because it can load the bare necessity for bootstrapping the application, and then it can lazy load everything else. So you're not loading the entire application. You're loading just the bits and pieces you need to get started. But on line 18 of this screenshot, you'll see that there's a div called app. And that's where our application is going to live. Think about it this way. You have that app div, and this is going to be your entire application. So if you have any sort of Chrome that goes around the top or the sides or the bottom, that's all going to live inside an app. And then you have this area in the middle, and we'll call it the slot. So if you navigate from the home page to the user listing to the product listing, well, the Chrome around the sides isn't going to change. Instead, it's going to be just that part in the middle because you're switching different views. Well, that's called a slot. So when we are at one URL, so route A, there's going to be one piece of content inside of that slot. But if we change the URL, we click on something, we change it in the URL bar, well, that slot gets replaced with some different content. And this is all done through a mechanism called routing. So Kevin, how do I tell Vue.js what components to use for different routes? So this is library number 1 that you don't have to use unless you want to take advantage of routing in Vue.js. And you also don't have to use the Vue.js router. I recommend it, but you don't have to use it. The Vue.js router is just called Vue router, and it takes a pretty simple configuration. You give it a list of routes. So basically 3 components. You have your path, you have your name, and then what component do you want to load when the URL path matches whatever path you have defined. And you also want to give these routes their own distinct names. Because what you could say later on is you could say, all right, Vue, I need you to load the about route. And so you don't need to remember, all right, is that /about/ something else, or is it /foo/bar? You don't have to remember the actual URL path. You just need to remember that's the about route. So you just do the setup. I'll come back to line 16 in a moment because that's actually a slightly different syntax. It leads to this question. So Kevin, does Vue download all the components when the page renders? Remember, it's one index.html with a whole bunch of code that's going to be tacked on to the end of it. And the answer is actually yes. If you don't do anything special, it will go through every component that you have defined and that you use in your application. And it will just download them all, stow them away for later. They're cached and ready to go. But that's actually kind of wasteful. You don't want to load every component up front. So there's this concept of lazy loading, where I could tell Vue, all right, the about screen, it's very unlikely that someone's going to load the app and then immediately go to the about screen. Most likely, they're going to click around and accidentally end up on the about screen. So let's not load the about screen immediately. Let's just tell Vue when it needs the about screen, we give it a function instead of just a component name. It will dynamically go load that view, no pun intended, when it needs to show it. So there might be a slight little hiccup in the render time, but it's not going to have all that stuff dumped on the screen when you load it initially. So in practice, how does this work? I never do this for things like login pages. I don't do things for like dashboards. I think about the flow of the user application. They're going to log in. I don't want to lazy load the login page. They need the login page. I don't want to lazy load the dashboard. They just need the dashboard. But forgot password. That's not a screen they go to very often. Let's lazy load that, and let's lazy load maybe their account details, because these are things they're not going to go to very often. And you can build in hooks and transitions. So if it takes a couple of seconds to load a screen, you can put up a loading transition. There are ways to fake it in UI that you're doing some work and that the person should wait. So lazy loading, I use this all the time. I also noticed in this screenshot, I have a comment called Webpack chunk name. This ensures that when a production build is done, that my files actually match some sort of construct, and it will pack like components together. So if I have a lot of components around user profiles that I want to lazy load, but I might not necessarily want to lazy load them all independently. I might want to put them all as part of one package. I can do that with chunk name. Now let's talk a little bit more about Vue components, just for your all's information. There's several different ways to build a Vue component. If you run through Vue tutorials or articles, you're probably going to see what I'm going to show you, which is a single file component, although that's not the only way to build Vue components. I would say it is the only way to build Vue components if you're building an actual application. That's probably a better way to put it. Again, there's three parts. There's the template, there's the styles, and there's the code, the script. And I don't have time to go into what makes up the script part of a component, but just understand that we have these three distinct areas. What does development of a single page application using both Vue and ASP.NET look like? Because this is going to actually lead us up into one of the big problems I had doing this development. So we have our browser, we have our little internal network, and I have my ASP.NET application, and that's running on one port. So 14500, whatever ASP.NET Core randomly decides. But I also have that VueJS application running on port 8080 or port 8081. And this is a problem because I want to serve up the VueJS application, but I want it to get data from the ASP.NET Core application. All right, well, let's come back to that. Well, how's it supposed to work in production? This is what most folks do, but you don't have to do it this way. You have your browser, it goes to a network, this magical internet, and it's not going to talk to the VueJS application. It's probably going to talk to the ASP.NET Core application first. And inside the ASP.NET Core application, you have this folder called www or www root that serves up just static files. And inside of that folder, you have your compiled VueJS application. Well, so you take the index.html out of that, and you serve it back to the browser. So that's great. That's actually the ideal solution. But how do we do that in development? Because I don't want to have to maintain two different basically environments. Where in development I'm maintaining two URLs, but in production I only really care about one URL. So how do I do one URL in development? It turns out that is actually a very possible thing to do. And it works like this. We have our browser, talks to the magical thing called the internet, and it talks to the ASP.NET Core application. But remember, that's not our UI. Our UI isn't there. And because we're running a development version of Vue.js, I need it to talk to that Vue.js application for any request that's not handled by, say, an API call. Well, this is done through a process called proxying, and it's not very well documented. So this is your documentation for future use. You can also do the proxy the other way as well. So you could hit the Vue.js application and proxy API calls to ASP.NET Core. I've done it both ways. I prefer this method just because I think there's less. This is less likely to screw up. I've had screw ups doing it the other way, but that's besides the point. So a request comes into our ASP.NET Core app. It's if you know ASP.NET Core, you know you have basically a request pipeline. It's going to say, well, is it this URL? Is it that URL? Should I go to this controller or that controller? Should I do this? Should I do that? And then at the very end, if none of those routes matched, what would normally happen? It would return a 404. Well, we don't want to return a 404. What we want to do is we want to, in the worst case scenario, return index.html from our Vue.js application. So that's what this process does. Side note, that kind of eliminates the concept of a 404. So that's a different discussion for a little bit later time. All right, so how do you set up the proxy in ASP.NET Core? That's actually done through this SpileServices.extensions package. Now, I am going to caveat right here for a moment. As of ASP.NET Core 3.1, this is still supported. So this is an extensions off of the SpileServices assembly, which SpileServices is being deprecated. So extensions, as far as I've read, is not deprecated yet. With .NET 5 on the horizon, it's actually really hard to tell. So I don't think this package isn't just going to go away, and it should still work in .NET 5 infrastructure. But you know, this stuff is pretty cutting edge. It could not work in the next month. I'm actually going to keep an eye on it myself because I have applications that rely on this. So let's talk about what it does. It actually does two things. It helps you in both development and production mode. When we're in our ASP.NET Core app inside of startup.cs, we will configure our services to add SPA static files. Now, this specifically is supporting production mode because when we do our production build, we're going to put our entire Vue.js application into the www root folder in ASP.NET Core. And this tells ASP.NET, all right, in production mode, serve stuff up out of this folder. Yay. In our configure method for setting up our route pipeline, you can see in the middle, I'm using endpoints to map controllers, so I have all my API functionality. But then I use SPA static files. So anything that's in production that isn't supported by an endpoint or other middleware gets served up from www. And then I have use SPA. And what use SPA does is that when we're in development, instead of returning a 404, it's going to proxy that request to my Vue.js server. And I hard code these URLs in. You can put them as configuration. As long as the port's not changing, you're pretty much safe. So this workflow, this was the magic sauce I got to make all this stuff work. You run both your applications, so npm, and you run .NET run. The end result, you can go to the ASP.NET Core port. So 17890, that's definitely an ASP.NET Core port. But it's going to load the Vue.js application because it's proxying that call over to our Vue.js app. So yeah, you actually now have the scaffold ready to support both a client-side and a backend application. Awesome. So Kevin, how do you deploy? Well, deploying is a little straightforward. You do an npm run build in your Vue.js application. This creates all the random files. So you can see the output. Chunk vendors, you have your application, you have some CSS. You want to copy these into the www root folder of your ASP.NET Core application before that application gets deployed. And you're probably not doing this part by hand. You have some sort of CI/CD, GitHub action, Azure DevOps action, or pipeline. Yay. So www root does all that. You're already done because you've set up this config file to say, all right, well, in production, we're using SPA static files. Yay. Little tip on Vue.js. There's a setting you can use called output directory in the Vue.js config. I always point that to the relative path to my www root because in source control, it's usually front end, back end. So we'll just tell it, all right, well, go into the backend app and drop it in www. It will delete everything in there, and it will replace it with the new fancy version of your Vue.js app. So don't put anything else into www, and this will work great for you. This only works in Vue. React doesn't support this, and they say very specifically we're never going to support it. I don't remember if Angular supports it or not, but oh well. All right, so you got your infrastructure going. How does Vue.js make a call to ASP.NET Core? Well, it's Ajax. If you've done jQuery or anything like that in the past 10, 15 years, you know exactly what you're doing. Vue.js doesn't have an Ajax provider built into it. So there are no sort of HTTP client. Like Angular does. It comes with the HTTP client. Vue is not opinionated. You can use whatever you want. You could use fetch, which is actually built into the spec and should be on any current generation browser, but it might not be. So I recommend Axios. It's actually what a lot of the Vue.js community uses, but it's not tied to Vue or React or Angular. You can actually use it anywhere you want to. But Axios is a promised async await based fetch framework. So you give it a URL, tell it go get data. This works amazingly well. But if you're in a new browser, you can just use fetch. Let's talk about the syntax for Axios. You give it a URL and then you give it callbacks, or you can use async await promises. So get a URL on success, do something. On error, do something else. Yay. This leads us into a new conversation of state. So how do I share state between components? Well, let's just talk about state in general. Each component manages its own state. So a child component is not aware of its parent's component state or its parent's component state or even its own children component states. They all care about their own unique state. So if a component wants to share state with another component, say a child component, it actually has to pass it in independently. Like this, I set up a property and say, all right, I'm passing in a list of users, and those users get passed down the line. And this is actually really good for downstream data. I just want to pass this information in. It will render a list of users. But if you want to push data back up, let's say this hello world component wants to manipulate the list of users. It cannot do that directly. What it actually has to do is it has to pass an event back up the stream and tell it, all right, I like to make a change to users. It's really cumbersome. Difficult to keep state in sync because the intention is, well, maybe that's not what you should be doing. For a lot of applications where maybe, here's a scenario. I'm loading a list of users and I have 3 or 4 components that all need to talk to that same list of users. Well, you don't want to load that list of users 3 different times. And you don't want the shell, the parent component of your application to maintain the list of users. What's your alternative? We use a global state management library. Vue uses Vuex, but you don't have to use Vuex. You can actually use like Redux or other state management libraries. But they work like this. And I know, super complicated graphic. You essentially maintain your state, and your state is mutated by a thing called mutations, but mutations are triggered by methods called actions. So your code, your component code, calls an action. That action performs a mutation. A mutation updates the state. And then the state, when it's updated, tells any other components in your application that the state has updated. I'm just going to note here, like Vuex is its own talk completely on its own. So if you don't understand it in a nutshell, I'm sorry, It's actually just the beast that we're discussing. So here you go. You have state, you have actions, you have mutations. An action kicks off a mutation which updates the state, and the state gets broadcast across the entire application to anyone that cares about it. And I'm going to speed up a little bit just for the sake of time. So all of our objects, we define the state in Vuex kind of up front with initial values. And it can be any types of data that you care about. Just numbers, it can be strings, it can be in arrays, it can be full-blown objects. You can put whatever you want to in state. And Vuex will manage the life cycle of these things for you. So if the global number changes, it will reflect that throughout the entire application. So mutations are the process that changes the state. And it's just what kicks off the change notifications to the rest of the applications. And these are just functions where when you need to update, I had a callback called load user success. So I got back a list of users from an API. Well, Vuex is going to give me the original state, the current state of the application, and I'm going to change the users object. Done. Vuex is going to go tell anyone who cared about users that users has been updated and they should update their components. And again, this is happening all underneath the scenes. You're not really writing any of the rendering code. This is just happening automatically. So how do we call a mutation? Mutations are done through these things called actions. So in my component code, if I need to load users, I'll go make a call to load users. Load users uses Axios to go to the API, get back the list of users, calls this little method called commit. Commit is just a method that executes a mutation. So the load user's success mutation will execute, passing in the new user data. The state gets updated, the screen updates, everyone's happy. So in the actual component itself, so come back to the single file component architecture. We need to tell this component to subscribe to state or state changes that we have defined. And that's actually done on line 16, 17, 18, 19, where I tell Vuex, I would like to get the state of users and the state of global number, and I'm going to map those to my own properties, users, and some number. I can use those up in the template as different render points. So on line 5, I'm actually iterating over an element. So this is really cool. This is really fast. Whenever that some number or that user's array changes, it's going to re-render that component for me. Map actions works very similar. I tell Vuex, all right, I want to subscribe. I want a copy of the load users method that I can use to go execute that action later. All right, and I'm wrapping this up right now. So last big question is around authentication and authorization. The first thing that we need to discuss is there's a difference between authentication and authorization. Authentication is just, are you allowed into the application? Then authorization is, what are you allowed to do in the application? For single page apps, this is super useful. We have cookie authentication, which has been around forever and works extremely well in same domain systems, where then ASP.NET Core, you just say, all right, use cookies, and you're done. Cookies are automatically sent to the server whenever any request is made. So it's easy to validate and to revoke. And yeah, cookies are pretty easy. There's also these new things called JWTs or JSON Web Tokens. I call them the new hotness because it's what all the API providers are trying to use now. They're not necessarily more or less secure than cookies, but they're 100% JSON based, but they're like they're an encrypted signed JSON object. But you can add your own metadata to this token. Like here's claims for this particular user. JSON tokens are not sent to the server by default. You have to actually write code to send the token along with a request. So not the easiest workflow. They have support in ASP.NET Core, but it's a lot left to be desired. You have to write your own like refresh and revoking processes. It's cumbersome. I'm doing it in one application, and I kind of wish I didn't do it now. Big rule here: never trust anything on the client. The client is dumb. Just the client's going to ask you to do things, and it's the server's responsibility to allow or deny. So make sure that the server is always the single point of truth. You'll just thank yourself later. So use your authorize features in ASP.NET Core on controllers or individual actions. And set this to roles, set different claims, do all the fancy authentication stuff. And lastly, yeah, handle your errors. I should actually have a whole set of slides on this, but I don't. These things will fail, and make sure on your client code that when a failure occurs, you tell the user about it or give them some generic, hey, something happened. We care about your patronage. Someone's been notified. Just make sure that people are aware of something going wrong, because there's nothing worse than error happening in the background of your application and the person not realizing it. So I have a sample of this entire infrastructure up on GitHub. Sample SPA, Vue.js, ASP.NET Core. It's actually everything A to Z I just talked about in just one little bite-sized packaged. But I'm not sure how much time I have left for Q&A, but I'm happy to answer any questions you all have. And if we don't have time afterwards, I'll just put back up my first slide, and you can reach out to me on the internet. All right. Do we have any questions, Lee?
Yeah, I've been asking. There was no questions so far in the Discord channel, and no questions so far in the Q&A. But please, if you have any questions for Kevin, do chime in either place, and he would be happy to answer them, I assume. Or maybe you're going to just shut him down. No, I'm not going to answer that one.
I'll hang out in the Discord for a couple minutes afterwards if anyone has questions.
Awesome. Oh, here we go. Can you please, sorry, this is Anonymous says, I'm going to publish. Can you please show the GitHub link again?
Here, I'll show my page link. That has a link to the GitHub.
Awesome. All right. Well, we've got 4 minutes. I'll just quickly announce what is coming up in the other channels in case you've missed it. So in the etc. track, Cameron Presley is, I can actually spend an evening or two building this. I gotta show it off if I can. Let's see. Oh, that means I would steal your screen. Are you okay with me stealing your screen?
Yeah, here, there we go.
Steal your screen. I'm gonna put it up there. So yeah, coming up in the etc. track is Cameron Presley with Establishing a Solid Foundation and Intro to Software Design. Sydney Andrews is talking about the MSAL.NET and writing authentication cool in the cloud track. In the data track, Matthew Groves, Demystifying NoSQL, the SQL Developer's Guide. And coming up next here, Melisha McGregor is going to give a presentation in a couple minutes here on securing your web application pipeline from intruders. And here she is. All right. Well, thank you, Kevin, very much for presenting. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. All right. Good luck, everyone. I'll be in Discord if you want to chat with me.